I need a spare tire.
Only the voters can.
Okay, I think we're live this morning, and good morning, everyone. This is the Senate Transportation Committee. It is Wednesday morning.
We just went live.
And our first item, we're going to continue our discussion with Patrick Murphy. And we started yesterday, didn't have enough time, and welcome back. Thank you for coming back. And continue where you wanted to for yesterday. Thank you.
Well, thanks so much. Patrick Murphy, the Sustainability Innovations Project Manager for Vermont Agency of Transportation. And I know that some of you have seen these slides from last year, a few of these, but they're just here for reference. So
February 1st, imagine that. Well, January go.
So what we're going to focus on this morning is this area within the climate action plan. That we have these targets that arose out of modeling that was done to meet the requirements of the Global Warming Solutions Act. And so we have to get at least to about 27,000 plug-in electric vehicles by 2025, in just a few years, and 126,000 by 2030. So we're going to focus on today the fast charging network that would be needed to allow for that kind of vehicle adoption. Sure.
Was it 8,000 we have registered?
Right now we have, as of July 1st, we have 7,500 or so, and based on kind of trends, we're probably at about 8,500. I think. Yeah. So
the other question that I have, and that is our goal, but you've got to have a supply. And so part of that analysis has got to be, are there going to be a sufficient, I know there are waiting lists and so forth, so it's sometimes a matter
That's
of.
right, the supply is able to keep up with it.
So, 2025 isn't, they're working on the FY24 budget now, so I'm just thinking about, and under the best of scenarios, some of this is constrained by technology and supply.
for sure, yeah.
I don't know if we've probably been looking at that in terms of estimating.
Yeah, so there's been definite supply issues over the past couple of years for a variety of reasons, and Dave Roberts from VEIC is also here, and he's been looking at this closely as well. One of the things by adopting the Advanced Clean Cars rules, the California regulations, starting in model year 2026, there will be a minimum number of vehicles sort of guaranteed to be delivered to Vermont. So that begins to get to what we need by 2030. But there is that interim period where supply will continue to be an issue, but there are, with those rules, the ability to gain early compliance from the auto manufacturers, and it's expected that that many will take advantage of that by delivering more vehicles up front and by doing it in a cheaper way for households with lower incomes. So hopefully, I think we're starting to see some of the supply issues ease, and we can get into that a bit later. But we also have a number of funds that the legislature, you all have appropriated last year to work away at that and make sure that households with moderate and lower incomes are able to participate in the transition with $12 million in the new PV program, $3 million last year in the Mileage Smart program, $3 million in Replace Your Ride. So we're hopeful that helps get us to where we need to be. And then the federal government, of course, passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which creates a new set of incentives, both used and new, that this year has gone into effect. The rules haven't been finalized. That should come probably in March by the IRS. But come 2024, those tax credits will become available to many more
Are they
households.
refundable?
In 2024, they'll be able to be refundable at the point of sale, so that both the used vehicle tax credit will be $4,000 off the top of the price of the vehicle if it's $25,000 or less, and then it remains to be seen how many vehicles will qualify for the new clean vehicle tax credit, which is dependent upon battery components and critical minerals being sourced, basically not in China, and an increasing percentage as you go, year to year.
My question earlier to Patrick was, what's gonna happen when everything turns to electricity? Where's the supply gonna come from when all automobiles, household heat is all heat pumps now? Everything is electricity. Will we ever meet the demand for electricity? I mean, there could be a rise in cost, it would be, but I don't know. You gotta buy electricity from somewhere. And,
Public Service Department's probably modeling that, right?
They gave us testimony last year showing us the,
they think they got enough to come.
yeah, well, especially in the near term, they see no problem. Long term, there could be a problem depending on how things go.
Because we're emphasizing electric on everything. Like I said, I've got the guy in my area, he can't keep up with heat pumps on every house. You can go into there buying them like crazy for the heat and or air conditioning, whatever you can call it. But, so we're gonna go away from all the fuels. Wow.
We will need generation in the outer years. I think it was like, they felt like confident next 20 years.
Really?
Got it.
Wow. Well, that's far ahead.
I guess the scary part for me is just watching the rollout of internet to all of Vermont, which I'm not particularly happy at the slow pace of it, but I understand that we've been promised a lot of things for a lot of years. But then I look at the rural areas and the state of the grid of where it's at, and if it's taking that long to get one wire up to get internet, I can't imagine what it's going to take to upgrade all of the infrastructure, which it does need it, I guess, from what I talked to of the power companies and stuff. They seem to be a little bit more concerned about that.
Although we did help last year in the budget, particularly the smaller utilities, to do some of those upgrades so that it didn't fall back on the ratepayers. And Hardwick Electric was one, but we have Linden Electric. So all those smaller municipal suppliers, we did a fairly significant, and I don't remember off the top of my head, appropriation to help them with the very needs that you're talking about, in recognition that they had to make, fund upgrades. And I don't remember, do you remember, Andy, what we put in finally to the?
I remember the dollar amount.
It was millions of dollars to help, so.
I think we certainly can get there, and I think we're on our way to get there. I just sometimes don't understand the rush to get there. We're making great progress and we're moving things along, and there's all kinds of proposals out there to make a lot of people in the state non-participants because of economics, and like to let all people be part of the decision to get there. So
It'll open up my age.
So there certainly will be pressures from the rising adoption of electric vehicles, but as Senator Perchlik has noted, that in the early years that shouldn't be as much of an issue. But I think it's also worth thinking about what opportunities might come out of EV adoption in terms of resiliency and the ability in the future to be able to help manage peak events, where you basically have a distributed network of battery storage, where consumers can be able to help in alleviating demand at peak times. So it does. It all comes down to the planning for all of this.
Will
But
we have enough batteries for these automobiles? I mean, I got a person that works for me there, the car is like 11 years old and it's hybrid. Now they're worried about replacing the battery, which is anywhere from $1,100 to $1,200.
So one of the things that was included in the bipartisan infrastructure law was funding to be able to develop the capacity to ensure that batteries are recycled. So that,
Okay,
That's been one of the major,
yeah, what do you do?
Concerns.
That's a big battery.
I'd like to see something that says that once you sell that vehicle, you might have sold the vehicle, but you still own the battery. And when that vehicle is no longer,
the manufacturer is responsible
yeah,
for it. We have that for other forms of
yeah.
electronics.
I'd love to see some legislation with that to where we always know where those batteries have gone to and are not piled up 3 or 4 deep in some backyard, because even then they're dangerous. They can still cause fires and cause harm.
They're kidding you.
Yeah, so I took a tour of the smaller scale too. Batteries are really problematic in the recycling streams, so getting them out of our waste streams is important. But on the previous point that you were talking about, I went up last November, right before Thanksgiving, to Montreal with the regional New England Council of State Legislatures, and Hydro-Quebec was giving a presentation, and they were to other senators from all over the region and legislators. They've got tons of power. So I think that they want to sell more to the state of Vermont. I think they need to be part of the conversation because they're a reliable energy source.
Well, they are a major source of power. It's incredible. I've been there to James Bay, and they actually, I think the reservoir is like the size of the state of Rhode Island. But you can imagine, it was very controversial because the impact on the environment and the indigenous populations that was their land. And so there was a lot of controversy here in the state, but they do have a lot of power, and we consume, I think it was about 1/3 of our power comes from Hydro-Quebec
Just what
now.
the cost will be at the time. That's the other thing. I mean, they got the power, but what are we going to pay for it?
But they also have other forms of electrical generation, and they say the water in the reservoir is like money in the bank. And so they have this sophisticated grid. So when the power, when they're generating power from wind or solar or what other forms, then they're not running those turbines to the same extent. So, but it's the environmental issues, like Churchill Falls. They took up falls the size of Niagara, and it's dry. I mean, they diverted it. So they to generate the power is certainly come at, some people would say, at a very high cost and environment. Yeah.
But to your point on supply, I just think the supply is there. Last thing, just mixed topics. I jokingly said, I'd be sort of buying more Hydro-Quebec power if y'all got the train service back up to Montreal. So
Oh, good.
I think we should bring representatives.
Oh, my
down
God,
here.
that mind is just going all the time. Well, can we go back to the other slide,
Sure.
Patrick? My question becomes, how many, if we want 126,000, we must have been looking at just what is the a number of new cars that are purchased every year, what that looks like. I'm just wondering what the 126 looks like in terms of the purchasing of used or new vehicles. Seems like over a 5-year period of time, that's what, 100,000, so that's 20,000 a year.
Right.
And what's that look like in terms of?
But just remember, there's some manufacturers going to stop making gasoline in a few years, so.
No, I know, I'm just talking about people buying, a replacement.
Right.
I've got a 2010 Honda Civic. It got really good miles.
Beautiful condition.
It's in beautiful condition, except for the rust and probably the air conditioning that doesn't work and whatever. But environmentally, it's probably better for me to get as much use I can out of my car as opposed to buying one.
Not
So
really.
it's not
No, it is.
So I'm just saying there are environmental trade-offs in terms of, yeah, my son's got the EV and I've got the old clunker. So I was just looking at coming up with that figure,
Sure,
how that looks like in just terms of purchase patterns and so forth relative to, you know, what we have for historical experience.
so this was modeled to closely align with the Advanced Clean Cars 2 rules, which will deliver X amount of vehicles.
But you gotta have people who wanna
Yeah.
purchase them.
Sure. And that's where the incentives and building out EV infrastructure come into play, because the highest cost, the highest barriers is really the high cost.
Well, for me, it isn't the
And-
cost, it's just
and then-
environmentally, I don't wanna buy a new car right now.
Sure,
And maybe I'm the exception, so that's what I was just thinking about. What would be that normal rate of purchase and how that looks against
You
that.
can register as an antique and save money.
I could.
so
I
I,
have a car that is an antique, but it's not registered as an antique. So, and it probably doesn't have a catalytic converter back in
Yeah, that's right.
1923.
They're stealing them back then too.
So I guess what I was just saying is, how does that 100,000 look like relative to just normal purchase history?
sure, yeah, I mean, that's,
Regardless of incentives, incentives will help you when you go to purchase, but I'm not sure.
How many new cars do we sell?
Yeah, I guess that's really what I'm trying to say, Andy.
I think it is on average about 20,000 a year.
So that means
But-
every vehicle then would have to be an EV to meet that target.
So, but Dave is correct, on average 40,000.
Or 40.
But, you know, there, about 73% of sales, I think, are used vehicle sales every year.
It's a
Yeah.
40,000 new.
Yeah, 40,000 new. And so there's no question that the rate at which people are buying new vehicles will have to kind of shift to be able to transition more into electric vehicles, because there just isn't a used vehicle market that really exists.
No,
And
no,
so, although,
not very large.
right, so although people are now buying at, you know, about 3/4 of sales are used, the incentives are geared at trying to get more people, instead of making that used vehicle purchase, to make a new purchase and get, you know, a good vehicle at about the same price that they might have paid for a used vehicle, and begin to develop those kind of second order impacts, so that others in the next few years are able to take advantage of by use plug-in electric vehicles. So there's no question that this is a ambitious target, but it's something that we have to shoot for in order to, you know, have some chance of meeting our requirements.
Patrick, can you just remind me the Clean Car 2 rules? Is there, it starts at 2026, and is it just a straight line to 2035, or is it steps?
It's not a straight line, and what I'll do is just share a slide with you afterwards to show what that projected
And it's,
curve looks like, but it's not even though it's laid out in this sort of, these are the targets, because there are ways for auto manufacturers to comply
in other states.
in other states and in different ways. It might not look quite like what the curve, you know,
By
demonstrates.
2035, those manufacturers for the states that are adopting the rule would have to 100% of their vehicles have to be
100%.
or zero emissions, not
Zero
necessarily
emissions,
plug-in.
which also includes the plug-in electric hybrids.
It could be fuel cells, it could be,
Yeah, good.
could be any other liquid fuel, like biodiesel.
But you're agnostic, as long as.
I think
It has to be zero emission,
I think it's just that,
zero emission for the vehicle.
so, So what I'm gonna try and do is just kind of run through,
You can try.
What?
I only got to the first slide so
we've
far.
got, we've just got 19 more, that's all.
You got 7 minutes left.
So,
Can you come back tomorrow?
many,
You might have, but I do have another question on the slide. Direct the PUC to consider EV charging rates. Is that something that you're just mentioning because that was in the plan?
This
Or
was,
does
this was just a list of
AOT have a
strategies.
position on that?
No, this was just a list of strategies within the climate action plan. And there was
So you're not
language,
endorsing it or not?
no, there was a language in the transportation bill, I think it was Act 55. So not last year, the year before, which sort of encouraged the utilities to look into rate
And they
design.
are doing
They're
that, but they
required.
need technology to support it, don't you?
They're required to have, all
Right.
utilities are required to have some kind of EV charging rate.
By 2024.
But don't you need internet in order to disaggregate your use, or for what's domestic versus charging?
You have to figure that out, but.
There's a lot. Okay, but, yeah, that would be, but that requires internet, doesn't it?
I mean, there might be other ways around that, like if you had a separate meter.
Yeah,
A separate internet, but yeah.
Yeah. Separate meters expensive. Yeah, there's a minimum charge, right? And then there's and then there's charges,
Well, it doesn't have to be a separate account, but yeah, just you need an electrician to come out.
but every meter comes with like there's an additional charge.
But we have like solar systems have a production meter and then you have your building meter. They don't do a monthly charge on the production.
So I've just made it through 4 more slides. So the next few slides are just to kind of, by way of reference, I know you've seen these before, but what we'll talk about today is just the DC fast charging. And the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, the formula funds that was authorized in the bipartisan infrastructure law, requires that there be a minimum of 4, and I've highlighted it here, CCS ports capable of charging 4 vehicles at 150 kilowatts or greater.
I said it last year, but I feel like I gotta say it again because repetition works in this role. I'm just worried that if we continue to put these charging stations up against embankments, that 5 years, 10 years from now, when people are waiting in line and trying to park their car to charge, they're gonna say, why the heck did the state fund these charging stations where you can only park 2 cars accessible to it? Whereas if you get it out in the middle, you could have like 8 cars waiting and you don't have to like shuffle cars around. I don't know if I'm making sense of what I'm saying, but I feel like if we're gonna put public infrastructure into these stations, getting them this centrally located inside of the pavement, and I know there's permitting related to it, but that just makes sense. Otherwise, I anticipate charge rage while people are waiting to charge their cars, 20 minutes, and then 20 more minutes, and then 20 more minutes, and having to move cars around. Do I make sense with what I'm saying?
Yeah, so I mean, part of the approval process through existing grant agreements that we have with Blink Charging and with Norwich Technologies, and what will be worked into contracts with other vendors, with the NEVI funds and others, will include site plans and making sure that there's the ability to increase the number of vehicles that can charge on site in the future. So that they're planning for both the electrical upgrades, but space.
Will they be near Tesla charging stations or will they be separate altogether?
That remains to be seen. Right now, Tesla charging stations are proprietary, so other vehicle models don't have access to them.
How many can charge at a Tesla station at one time? 2 cars?
They have 8, don't they?
Well, so generally Tesla's installing, banks of chargers. There might be 10 charging stations or more, but
We have them in South Burlington at Healthy Living, and they put them right in the center of the parking lot because it makes a lot of sense. So you can sort of queue, and then if you have to wait, you just.
Tesla or all?
Tesla. So I just, with this photo that you cropped, I like that. I'm still concerned when I see those things up against embankments and
Well,
not
it is,
more.
it is interesting you're talking about that, because when we were waiting for a charging station in Manchester, and other people were driving in, and you were saying, oh my God, they don't know we're waiting, or are they gonna try to run, ahead of me? And what's the truck, the Rivian? Yes.
Yep.
And so they came barreling in. And we're already there waiting. And so it does pose a problem, like a gas, there's a queue. And I guess the guy in the Rivian decided he would go find some other place because all the charging were filled. So I see what you're talking about in terms of protocol in line, because if you've already sat there for 20 minutes and then somebody comes whipping in and the other car is
Are they all
leaving.
different rates? All different rates that you pay when you?
Yes, yeah, and so I can,
But they do have I want you to know, they do have a fast charge at Atwater Market and Montreal. Yeah, it's really handy, and they're all marked.
Are we installing any CHAdeMO or requiring CHAdeMO still?
yes.
Are there any new cars that have CHAdeMO, or is Nissan still doing that?
Nissan still has a CHAdeMO connection.
What's that?
When are they gonna get that up?
I'm not entirely sure. I don't have their,
There's two different plugs, and Nissan's the only one that has one, so you have to have their.
No adapter.
so I believe there's,
Is there?
not that I'm aware of.
Wow.
Tesla has an adapter, so they can use it.
Their newer model, the kind of more expensive SUV model, I believe has transitioned to the CCS model.
So
But
it seems ridiculous that we'd still be installing. Is the feds requiring that a CHAdeMO be?
they're not requiring, so that's why I highlighted the CCS. That's the standard that they've issued, but
I mean, I
but
feel
what we've included in these past grant agreements is a CHAdeMO connection, and we may require that at least one charging station has the ability to charge, because we do have a number of Nissan Leafs
Yeah, no, a lot, yeah.
in the state. We don't want to leave those folks behind, especially as the newer Leafs then still, get worked into the used vehicle market, that people just don't have the same ability to get around as other vehicle
Well,
models.
Why did they go different? Why they go with everybody?
It was kind of like the VCR Betamax, one company just up there, they use it in Japan, I think other Japanese cars use it. in Japan. Yeah, I think now it's settled that this CCS, other than Tesla is doing it.
So
But I worry in 10 years, we have all these like
obsolete.
CHAdeMO that nobody's using. They're-
So-
Can they be adapted?
So the cords themselves, the connections themselves can be swapped out.
The power is the same.
Okay,
So this just, again, this is I've highlighted sort of what we're focused in on with the National
I
Electric.
really like that 10-minute one.
So
How many cars they can
there's, so the vehicle's battery has to be able to receive that
I know,
amount of power, and but there's there may be places in Vermont that we do choose to locate a couple of 350 kilowatt stations, and then we can put 2 ports on that, and that will then still be able to meet the federal guidance.
What batteries, are there vehicles that actually have batteries that can do that 10-minute charge?
like the luxury vehicles,
There's very few.
BMWs.
Yeah.
The Mustang can do 150.
So
Do you have that on your chart, David?
We just have a plug, not the actual maximum power, and it's a little. We want to get into it, we can, but a lot of times what happens, and for the record, Dave Roberts will be talking next with the ICA coordinator by the Electric Vermont program. So the peak power that can be accepted by fast charging is usually just at the start of the charge. Right. And as it goes on, there's some tapering that happens, and so typically you see you get an 80% charge around that peak power, sometimes significantly tapering occurs significantly before that. So even if a Porsche Taycan, which is a super high-end, super fast charge vehicle, can handle 350 kilowatts of power, which is that sort of 10-minute range that we're talking about. can't necessarily do that for the entire time it's plugged in. It's definitely evolving. We're seeing Hyundai, which also is partners closely with Kia, basically very similar company out of Korea. Their Ioniq 5, Hyundai Ioniq 5, Kia EV6 are up over 200 kilowatts for at least some portion of fast charging. But that equipment costs a lot more to put in. There's more power infrastructure issues. So there's definitely some trade-offs with stepping up to that level. But if we're talking about a 10-year life for the equipment, we do expect to see more of that higher power fast charging coming in. Some of the new GM vehicles that are coming out later this year, starting to come out now, Cadillac, and later this year, they'll be over 200 kilowatts.
Maybe that could be my new car.
Yeah, you should get the Cadillac Lyric.
Yeah, because we would advertise that Abel would sell me.
So this is to give you a sense of the costs that we're looking at for fast charging, and likely because of we're on the higher end of the fast charging, where what we'd be installing in various locations. This is what we would be looking at in our contracts. This upwards of $250,000 around.
So, Patrick, I must confess, we have charging stations that are privately owned.
Mhm.
And they negotiate, and they have them sometimes in shopping, by stores, et cetera.
Yes.
And they charge and they whatever. So we have that kind of private market, and then the state is funding what? Can you just be clear on what we're funding and for whom?
Yep.
On this? Are we paying those vendors to install, and then they get as an incentive for them to underwrite the cost, and then they get the revenues? Could you just clarify what our money's buying here?
Sure. So the way it's worked in the past couple of grant agreements with Blink Charging and with Norwich Technologies is we've identified locations where we see there being a need for charging, and money has been granted, generally 80% of the project costs, although it's been less, I think, for some of the projects because there's just been overruns that the private charging provider would have to eat, essentially. But a share of the charging installation costs, that's what the state is paying for. And they're also paying for the provider to be operating these and maintain these over the course of 5 to 7 years. So it's minimum 5 years required by the federal formula funds that we'll be using in the future. But this is a model that we'd be using, that we're taking public funds and we're allowing stations to be built, because some of these places, I know Senator Engels has talked about it in the past, that there just isn't necessarily the demand for private providers to move into more rural areas where there might not be a good business case. And so that's the role of this public money, is to make sure that there's a consistent, broadly enjoyed network across the state and across the country so that people can participate.
The role is to help finance the installation and help underwrite repairs and the maintenance for a set period of time.
Right. And so this is also seen, I think, both by the state of Vermont and by the federal government as a sort of down payment, in the sense that it's not always going to be the case that public money is funding all of the stations. That we have to be able to reach a critical mass of EV adoption for then there to be the willingness on the part of private providers to begin installing on their own based on
They gotta get a piece of the action, and like, we gotta get a piece of action. The states, we haven't talked about that yet.
So
15% threshold is out there recommended. I don't know what the number is, but.
yeah, the 15% is kind of what people point to as that's the point at which you get more of the general market demand, where people are starting to adopt that aren't the kind of innovative upfront, people that are going on out on a limb before a national network is built. So that's how people have looked at the innovation curve. And
We also, 15% has been suggested at the point we need to replace the lost tax revenues and
Mhm.
whether it's vehicle miles traveled or for the traveling public and out of state, we would obviously have some kind of charge as when they're doing the fast charge at one of these stations. So, I mean, we've kind of identified how we would get that revenue replacement. It's just at what point it kicks in.
Yeah, and so there'll be some more discussion on that in House Committee this week or next week, I think. And you'll definitely be seeing language around that proposal, mileage-based user fee proposal.
From the AOT,
Um,
as well as a KW charge for the public chargers.
We had looked at that last year and determined that it was not actually a cost-effective way to collect revenue from out-of-state vehicles. So that's still an open question. But
There is no cost-effective way in your view to collect from out of state.
Unless you have the power, whoever's supplying the charger, the power or whatever, collect the fee, just like we asked them to do. We asked stores to do that.
Well, that's what you just said, it wasn't cost effective.
it seems like it should be simple, but as you get into it,
Well, we have other models that do that, right? We have the stores that do that. We have every part of government, we have somebody else collecting our tax money and sending it in.
Charging, they collect it as part of what they charge to your charge account.
There's certainly a number of different factors involved in that discussion, and I'm happy to follow up with the report that came out of that road usage charge study last year that kind of gets into the details of why that might be more challenging than it seems. So this is getting to your point, Senator Kitchell, about operating costs. This is what projected operating costs for the higher end levels of fast charging might look like. And one of the things that is allowed in the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure funding is operating costs up to 5 years. And so in the more maybe challenging locations for which there might not be a good business case, the state may in fact look to help with operating costs as well, because some of these places might not see any sort of profit in the first 5 years.
And I would just add to that too, Patrick. Some of these places that don't model well because of maybe the population isn't there, doesn't mean that we don't have a huge influx of out-of-state people coming in with that technology. And it could really impact where they go in the state, where they want to go to, and if they don't have the infrastructure there.
Yeah.
So, I mean, the rural areas can be on the end of it on a double whammy. They're not getting the infrastructure because they don't have the vehicles there, and they're getting the tourist traffic because they don't have the infrastructure there. So, I mean, some of these models are gonna have to be modeled.
Well, that's why they have one up there in Island Pond.
Mhm.
Yeah, so the state goal and the goal of the NEVI funds is really to make sure that we're filling all of those gaps and not leaving any
And
part
these
of
are
the
public,
state or the network
But
behind.
there are private that are not on here.
Yep, that's correct. Yeah, these are just the publicly funded since 2014 or so.
But there's
Do I have
an
a
app that will tell you exactly where they all are. There's
Including drive electric substations.
So, yeah.
Maybe we'll even see a slot.
The PlugShare app is the one you're thinking about.
Yeah.
That's the one I recommend. drivers.
And I'll tell you if there's a free spot.
It depends on which network it's on, but many of them will do that.
So I won't run through all the historical investments here, but this, I do want to kind of touch on a couple of things before I turn it over to Dave. So we are in the middle of filling out 17 locations. This is through grant agreements, 2 grant agreements with the Agency of Commerce and Community Development. And then I'll just highlight some of the new locations that were privately funded. So there are a number of different entities that are beginning to fund their own stations. BMP certainly is the state's largest utility, has a strong plan to be able to build out throughout their network, even in those more rural areas. Auto dealerships are beginning to be required to do so if they're to be able to receive the deliveries expected through Advanced Clean Cars 2. And then there are convenience stores that have already sort of seen what's to come and begun installing stations on their properties. And then various community attractions like ski resorts and some hotels have begun to do that as well, to your point, to make sure that they're inviting tourism to their locations. So I want to give just this broad overview of what are the funding sources out there that help build out this network. The biggest one for us is the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program funds, which will be $21 million over the course of 5 federal fiscal years, so through federal fiscal year 2026. The Inflation Reduction Act continued a tax credit or revived a tax credit that's available for EV charging, both on the residential and commercial side. We also have the Carbon Reduction Program we mentioned yesterday. EV charging is an eligible expense, and I think that there's a good case to be made that we're using some of those funds to locate off the alternative fuel corridors. So the NEVI funds have to be used on those designated alternative fuel corridors, but there are some places within the state where those designations don't exist and where we would still want to locate charging anyhow.
That's an example.
So there's, Stowe is not on any sort of corridor. A lot of the east-west routes don't necessarily have the designation, and so those are areas we'd want to fill in because you still see lots of traffic there, but not necessarily to be able to gain the designation. So once we invest in those locations, then we'll be able to later, through the designation process, add those corridors. And then there are competitive grants through the federal funds, and what the NEVI program calls gap filling grants, which are geared towards more rural places. All of the final rules on these programs have not been issued yet. We're still waiting for them, and I know this time last year we had just received guidance, and but we do not have the final rules on that or on the Buy America provisions, which it hinders our ability to actually get contracts out, and until we know what those requirements will be. And then sometime in the future, we don't know when, there'll be some other similar designation process for medium heavy duty electrification planning, so freight corridors. The timeline for the NEVI program, we submitted a plan back in July that was approved in September. That allows us to unlock the first 2 years of funding. And then this year we'll have a more substantive public engagement plan. So the rules are very highly prescribed. We can only locate certain areas within a mile of the state highway network and within 50 miles of the next fast charging location. So that very quickly narrows the number of eligible sites. But we'll be looking at what are those places off corridor. BDIC, Drive Electric Vermont, has helped the agency with developing a survey that will help identify what are the prospective site hosts who are interested in having EV charging, and we'll be able to work through some of this public engagement to get an idea of where there is actual needs and future
So the
demand.
50 mile and the 1 mile,
Yeah.
that's fast charge? Or if you have level 2, that isn't,
No,
50
it's
miles isn't worth much.
it's for the second bullet point here, that the minimum requirements of the 4 CCS ports capable of charging 4 vehicles at 150 kilowatts. So it's the fast charging, not. And many of the locations that are being built out right now, there's also level 2 charging, just for redundancy, but the primary focus is on fast charging. And so this plan has to be updated every year in order to unlock the next year's funds. These are the corridors that I just mentioned. And so you can see kind of what's left out in the map, and what we might fill in with other sources of funds,
So Route 4 isn't on it.
right?
Route 2 is. Ross is left out.
Looks like the Route 2 just stops at Marty's there.
I think so.
So the lighter green is the designation by FHWA is corridor pending. To us, there's really no difference. We're going to be able to locate on those corridors as well with the NEVI funds and build those out. So these are the 15 initial locations we identified through the plan, looking at things like travel demand and access to 3-phase power, but also some more demographic data, race, socioeconomics, and so trying to understand who are the populations that would be impacted. So the initial 15 locations are identified here. 7 of those we would look to upgrade almost immediately this year through working with our existing vendors, getting contracts to upgrade those station locations where there already is work being done, and with site agreements. And so I think we'll be able to do those sites, the 7 listed here, more quickly than the other 8.
That's the green stars.
Those are the green stars, yeah.
And the yellow stars next year, or?
And not necessarily next year, but we'll have to wait a bit longer first to get the final rules and what are the Buy America provisions. With these, we may be able to use mostly the ARPA funds that you all authorized last year, the $2 million,
Is the yellow,
which don't come with the same set of requirements as the NEVI fund.
is the yellow star exit 1? That's around exit 1, White Junction. What exit is that, or is that exit 2?
It's I'm not sure which
Or is
exit it is, but these are sort of, they're not necessarily like you have to locate here,
Somewhere
but
around
in the
there.
general area. So
Right, because there's no Vermont charger around there. There's in West Webb, there's some good.
right, and so there is some coordination going on with other states, with New Hampshire, and so we will still be able to sort of get credit for theirs, but we then have our own state goals that requires every exit on the
I want to charge
interstate.
in Vermont, I don't want to charge there.
Well, so that's why we've got it on the map.
Okay.
So New Hampshire, you can't charge because they have.
Well, right there.
they
Yeah,
have
there's
no
just
infrastructure.
over the border within maybe 5-10 miles, yeah. So I went through some of these prioritization factors. Multifamily housing, Senator Chittenden brought up a question earlier about who's really using these fast chargers, and in a lot of cases it will be the sort of interstate travelers or in-state travelers who are on longer trips. in some more narrow cases, it may be people who just don't have access to home charging. So there's, about a quarter of the population of Vermont doesn't live in a single family home, so they don't have access to that cheaper charging that they can do off peak during the night when they're asleep or whatever it might be. So there's more of a need maybe to use the public charging network and the fast chargers in particular.
We did
So
put money in for multi-family housing.
yes, yeah. There's $1 million in the prior transportation bill, and then last year's transportation bill, there was the $10 million, or the big bill, $10 million, and at least 30% of that will be focused on multi-unit dwellings. So the more we can work away at that people have access to cheaper, charging at home, whether it be through the multi-unit dwellings or a single family, the better we're going to be, and the fewer charges of these really expensive fast charges will need to be deployed to build out a network.
I just want to crystallize this point because in my mind, I'm speculating, and I think you're validating it to some extent, that the user base of gas stations is not going to be the same user base as these fast charging in composition wise. I think locals go use the gas stations, but I think locals are going to probably prefer to charge at home so they're not losing that time meandering around, and that's also going to be cheaper and they can just plug it in and settle in for the night. So I just think these charging stations are going to draw more people that are unfamiliar with the area, and that we as a state, that be it from a Vermonter or an out-of-stater, want to think strategically as much as we can with these public dollars, that these are in spots that represent or are accessing our local economies and the best parts of Vermont, because they're going to people
They
visiting our
do,
space.
because even that 20-minute or half an hour, you want to have a cup of coffee or shop,
Free cup.
free coffee.
No, that's on the interstates. No, we can charge them here.
There's no question there'll be business models as people, figure all of that out. Certainly, there's a great plan or a great idea that you can stop in and charge in 20 minutes, use the bathroom, get something to eat, and then by the time you're all set, on you go again. So Howard Johnson's coming back.
Yep, so it's definitely a part of the prioritization that we looked at in terms of what are the access to other services around, how does it maybe fit with local economic development as well. I think I'll wrap up here so that Dave has time to go through his presentation. So just for next steps, as I mentioned, we're kind of surveying the total universe of potential site hosts. That is one of the areas we've seen where we've seen delays in other projects, is where you're trying to work out a site host agreement, it doesn't work out, and you have to pick up and go through a permitting process and a whole nother negotiating process with a different site host. So we're trying to, through our contracting approach, eliminate that key delay. We don't know the final rules or Buy American provisions, but when we do, we'll then begin to get more of this funding out, and we'll continue our public engagement so that this really can inform future iterations of the plan, which is due annually. And then we'll be working with Dave and his team on some workforce development initiatives that make sure that the funding is not just being deployed in places where it's widely enjoyed, but that the folks who are helping us to build out this network are also benefiting from that. And then this is a big learning process for the agency and agencies across the country. And so we'll treat it as such. We'll continue to learn from what we issue in all kinds of different rounds, and then be able to work those lessons into future rounds of funding.
And thank you for allowing us to have a wide-ranging discussion with a lot of questions being answered. It kind of goes on to that point of what you just made, that there's a lot to still figure out. So to have you come in here and let us, just talk freely getting you off your schedule a little bit is very helpful sometimes just to talk it through. So appreciate that.
Yeah, no problem.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
So we're going to give a little time.
Yeah, and I am joined remotely by my colleague Peter Walk. So I'll just-
Peter Walk is going to go also.
Yeah, he's on through the Zoom.
Okay.
Can't hear you, Peter. You can hear
Can
us.
you hear me now?
Yeah, there we go. Okay. good point.
Combination of not being on mute and the headset. I appreciate the opportunity to be here via Zoom today. Unfortunately, as of this morning, I have tested positive for COVID, and so I'm very happy not to be sharing my germs with all of you this morning. So, but appreciate the opportunity to still be here.
All right, we have our next Dave Roberts and Peter Watt. Go right ahead.
Okay, thanks. So as I mentioned earlier, Dave Roberts, I'm a managing consultant with EIC, and we coordinate the Drive Electric Vermont program. And here to share some information on sort of broader VIC efforts that include Drive Electric Vermont, but also the work that Efficiency Vermont has been doing. And so joined by Peter, who's the director of Efficiency Vermont. And get this presentation up and rolling. So I don't know, Peter, if you want to run through the agenda and the about, and then I'll take over from there.
Sure. Thank you. And for the record, Peter Walk, Managing Director of Efficiency Vermont. It's nice to be with the committee again in a slightly different context. Happy to run through this. We'll try to get you back on schedule as much as we can and run through these quickly. We have a bunch of slides. Some of them can be leave behinds for you. If they prompt further questions, we're happy to come back in as we go forward. We want to talk a little bit about sort of how do we think about overall electrification programs in Vermont, thinking about starting from the source of those emissions, what policies and programs exist in the landscape already, the role that our organization as a whole, the EIC, plays through both the Drive Electric Vermont programs and the Act 151 work, the Energy Efficiency Modernization Act, which you all passed in 2020. And then leave you with some thoughts about future opportunities and considerations as we think about the great work that Patrick and his team in collaboration with all of us are doing. So I'm gonna go to the next slide. So quickly, we are, VEIC is formerly known as the Vermont Energy Investment Corporation. We are a nonprofit organization that serves to generate energy solutions that the world needs. We are based in Winooski. We operate under appointment from the PUC, Efficiency Vermont, the statewide electric efficiency utility. We also operate the District of Columbia's sustainable energy utility and do contracting work such as the clean transportation work that Dave and Jen Wallace-Brodeur and others that you've heard from over the course of time do to advance different programs across the country. So next slide, Dave.
So I'll pick up from here. Just, I know you've heard this information before, but just kind of level setting reminders, I guess, as far as greenhouse gas emissions. Won't dwell on this very long, but takeaways here: transportation is the single largest source of greenhouse gas emissions. As of the latest inventory, which is for the year 2017, it's about 39% of the total. And out of that, about 73% was light duty vehicles. So, obviously there's a need to look at diesel and medium and heavy duty vehicles. It's a significant share, but light duty vehicles is the majority of the transportation emissions. And, it's a tough nut to crack. I've been working on transportation planning issues in Vermont for over 20 years now. I worked as a transportation planner for the Burlington area, looking at multimodal transportation options, getting people out of cars. It's a real challenge. That work continues. It's very important. It's a critical element to the Climate Action Plan transportation recommendations. But over time, we see at least the 10-year period shown on this slide, maybe a 5% decrease in gasoline diesel use from transportation over the 2008 to 2017 period. So it makes you, at least for the work we're doing at EIC on transportation electrification, it calls into, how do we use some technology options?
Through 2017, I would assume between 17 and now? I don't know. Have we made progress?
We should have. I mean, hopefully, more recent inventories will be coming out, and we should see. I mean, certainly during the COVID shutdowns, we know that fuel use decreased, but maybe not as much as some people would have thought. So, we should be making progress, but there are.
ComQuvet shows the tax revenue, there was a pretty big drop.
Yeah, for sure. But it's back up now.
No,
But yeah, so it continues to be a challenge, reducing transportation greenhouse gas emissions, and certainly, getting people out of cars is the best way to reduce emissions from an economic and environmental perspective. But in a state like Vermont, there's challenges with that. So, that's led us to support some of the transportation electrification work. We've heard from Patrick.
Also trucks add a lot to it.
Sure.
There's a lot of trucks.
About a quarter.
They're getting better.
Yep.
But trucks have been a big.
Yeah, and there is a separate regulation called Advanced Clean Trucks, which is sort of like the Advanced Clean Cars, which is focused on light duty vehicles.
Right.
So there will be, but for those long haul trucks that even looking out into the future with that Advanced Clean Trucks rule, it's a long ways out before those become totally zero emission.
so there hasn't been a GHG inventory since.
Not to my knowledge.
I guess I thought it
That was 2021.
So there's, I'm gonna put on my former hat briefly, as DEC commissioner. The GHG inventory always lags just from national calculations that flow down to Vermont. I understand there were some revisions to the way in which we calculate transportation emissions in last year's in the most recent inventory, and the department is working to catch up. I think they're planning on through 2020 in this next batch of updates. So it'll give us some much more recent data.
So the goals that were modeled for the climate action plan, pathways analysis, this 27,000, 126,000, very ambitious. If we just look at the last several years of registration data that we have access to, most recently 7,500 in July of 2022, and just project an exponential trend, you can see even an exponential trend is a little bit less than where we need to be to hit those goals. And that is very ambitious. So a lot of work to do on many fronts to hit these goals. A lot of work is already underway. So we've got many different programs addressing different sort of segments of transportation electrification in Vermont. We've got the light duty programs, medium and heavy duty, e-bikes, EV charging, some of the supply chain work you'll hear more about from Peter momentarily.
Act 151. I never remember acts.
Yep.
Tell
So
me what it is.
that is the term that we use, at least at VIC, is Energy Efficiency Modernization Act. So that's what's allowing the Efficiency Vermont program to use ratepayer funds to support some transportation electrification work. And Peter will get into a lot more detail on what that looks like for them. And then just broader consumer awareness and education. So, how are we making sure Vermonters know that these options exist, where to find them, how to charge, all of many things. So lots of different funding streams, different things. And the work that we're doing at VIC for Drive Electric Vermont, we're really trying to tie together a lot of these different things to become a kind of one place, one-stop shop. So people who are looking to learn more about incentives or, how to drive an EV or, understand what the policy environment is in Vermont. We started this work back in 2012 as a partnership between VIC and the state of Vermont, and it's continued since then. We have quarterly stakeholder meetings where folks in the industry, utilities, advocates, others can get together to hear some of the latest developments.
From VEIC.
No, we are.
Part of that organization.
Drive Electric Vermont is sort of it's a partnership, we call it. It's not a separate entity. It's essentially, we like to say we coordinate it at VIC because we work closely with others across, for example, utilities or participants in our stakeholder meetings. So it's not a separate legal entity. It's a program that VIC coordinates.
Okay.
So So we're doing a variety of work. We've got a website out. Might check that out if you haven't already. Got a lot of information on there. We try to keep it current. For example, the Inflation Reduction Act changes to federal tax credit. It's been a task to keep pace with all those changes. So our website does have that information. One of the critical ingredients to some of the work we've done as Drive Electric Vermont is outreach and education. We know there are some Vermonters who are already there and they're already driving EVs or they're ready to make their next car an EV, but more people are just sort of uncertain. They've heard of EVs now. It's not, 10 years ago when we started this work, it was, what's an EV? Do these really exist, or is this just a golf cart kind of thing? And now people know about EVs, the different models that are out there to a degree, but they're not sure how it could work for them. So we have resources to help them understand how it could work for them. We have a customer support team who can answer calls and inquiries related to EVs. And we're working on sort of new aspects to the work that we do that's going to hopefully increase the sort of firsthand experience people have. So there's a lot of opportunities for events, so electric vehicle demonstration events that we've supported and helped organize over the years. Continuing that work, potentially working with rental car companies, dealers, and others to provide more opportunities for firsthand experience, because people, once they kind of get behind the wheel, it shifts from like just EVs are out there to, no, this is a real car, it actually performs better.
Dealers don't have a lot of availability in the product too. So
right now, that's a very, very challenging situation to continue.
Dealers aren't promoting them big because they don't have them. It takes months to get one.
Yeah.
Are you
Depends.
still working with the dealers as far as training us, talk to consumers about?
Yeah.
You
So
do that, you still do that?
that is a big part of the Act 151 work that Efficiency Vermont's been doing. And so definitely be talking about that. So I mentioned technical assistance. So just, variety of different ways that we're trying to fill gaps and support both consumers and businesses, municipalities, others across the state. We've supported state programs in a variety of different capacities, including supporting some of the work for V-Trans on the plan.
It's just the cheap comes out expensive, and if it's cheaper to put them there against an embankment now, it's just going to cost all sorts of grief and frustration.
There might not be.
They're going to blame us.
At this parking lot, there might not be a middle parking spot. Maybe it's just two roads.
I'm just saying, they're going to blame the legislators around the
They're
table.
gonna blame you.
Yeah.
There's also challenges with snow clearing. If you put them in the middle of the lot, it's harder to plow, maybe more costly if you're having to trench through hard surface. So there's a lot of trade-offs.
You get the point, though.
I do get the point. Yep, for sure.
You keep saying it every time.
But the repetition works, I find, so.
I think we need some new pictures.
Yeah.
Some of the work,
We've seen this one before.
yes, so courtesy of V-Trans. So, BIC has supported a number of bus projects, electric transit and school bus, grant writing for V-Trans's low and no emission bus programs, a variety of things. So a lot of work here. I'm sure Ross and others from V-Trans provide more information on some of the work that we're doing to support them.
Dave, back to your website, can you get us a new sheet for our bulletin board? I think that one's.
I brought some with me, so I will turn those around. So moving right along, because I know we're tight on time, I do want to make sure Peter has opportunity to talk about the Act 151 program. So Peter, if you're.
Great. Thanks, Dave. That's a great overview and a good sense of, one of the pictures we were trying to paint today is that there's a lot going on and a lot that needs to go on. Part of that effort was in 2020, you all passed the Energy Efficiency Modernization Act, which was a 3-year pilot to enable the electric efficiency utilities, us and VED, to be able to do work in the both the transportation and the thermal spaces using a portion, at this point up to $2 million of EEC collections per year on work related to transportation and thermal use. And as Senator Perchlik referred to, much of that is focused on how do we transform this market, right? We've been talking about educating consumers for a long time. Drive Electric Vermont is the seminal program in the country to be able to get that information out to consumers to help them answer those questions. And our sort of sales and support and service network around the state needs that level of support too. So what we've been really focusing on in the complementary way to the work that the state has supported through Drive Electric Vermont in that overall partnership is to really think about what does the supply chain look like? How do we make sure that once vehicles are there, that the dealers have the ability to charge them, to service them, et cetera. There are a lot of obligations being put on the dealers by the original equipment manufacturers that are challenging for them to comply with, to be able to expensive capital purchases, and we're trying to help with that, along with support for their sales teams, both in terms of training and in terms of incentives for the sale of electric vehicles. Clearly, the supply issues we've seen as part of the sort of supply chain challenges that have come out of the pandemic have been a challenge, but we've seen tremendous growth in interest for electric vehicles and understanding, so that as that supply chain becomes less tight, then we can we'll start to see some of the impact of that work over time. You want to go to the next slide, Dave? This is just a sense of the number of dealers we've worked with around the state, both new and used dealers. I think is important to mention. As we've talked about, I think in this committee before, ultimately the market in Vermont for electric vehicles needs to provide vehicles to everybody. And for many Vermonters, that is not a new vehicle. And so making sure that we are helping to support the used vehicle infrastructure as well. The program launched in the fall of 2021, will run through the end of 2023 when the pilot sunsets. And it's in conjunction with a statewide electric vehicle marketing campaign that is helping to draw interest and move that interest from sort of an understanding of electric vehicles into consideration of whether or not they might purchase. So far, we've had 50 participating dealers around the state, representing 12 different counties, 45 new, 5 used. We're helping support infrastructure projects like EV charging infrastructure. As I said, dealer and sales incentives, salesperson incentives, overall training, education, and marketing promotional support for that work. Next slide, Dave.
I like the next photo.
Can you just say,
No, we got it. We're not in remedial student education here.
It's original.
I know, huh?
we'll take a photo of the Tesla bank, which is right.
You ought to see the lights on that thing. They're really
That's a
something when
Hummer.
they come driving in. That's,
Cool for other cars.
Well, that's-
Cars, they look so long.
Go ahead, Peter. We're done with our comment.
yeah,
I'm happy to wait.
I'm looking
As
at
I
the
mentioned-
prices of all these new ones here.
Go, Jay.
Yep, and the beauty of the Inflation Reduction Act, which I know JFO is working through, much of that is many of the tax incentives are back, especially for models or brands that were out of. I don't know if you've heard details of that yet. We are looking towards, sort of trained a number of staff around the state in how to sell what EVs look like. I remember the first time that I walked into a dealer in 2017, 2018 to ask about an electric vehicle. There wasn't a lot of information because they were new, they hadn't been supported in this way. And so this helps us work with the dealers to understand what their needs are to make sure that things are supported from sale all the way through service. So, we don't claim the credit for any of the vehicles that are saved, right? The greenhouse gas emission saving, we work with our partners in the tier 3 and the state incentive world. But we believe that over 477 up to the point of the slide being made of sales have been supported by this effort to making sure that there is the push to transform the market as a whole and not simply put incentives out there, put information out there and hope that the market can respond. We're going to need to do this faster, as Dave mentioned, than that exponential curve would simply allow for. So you can go to the next slide, Dave.
I had a question on the places, the EV readiness, the charging station, so that helped a station be able to receive electric vehicles that otherwise wouldn't have, because they need to have the charging to get the cars. So you just help them
Yes.
expense.
Yep. So we work on both charging behind the, in the back of the dealer and in the front of the dealer to make that work best. Work with them on the tools and equipment they might need to, and help them receive their overall certification program within the state.
Was one of sorry, Peter, was one of these the Nissan dealer, and we had that testified here a couple of years ago, said like they would like to sell electric vehicles, but the cost to put in the charging stations and train the staff and get the different tools, it was like that was prohibitive.
I'd have to look, if you could give me the name of that dealer, I'm happy to look up to see whether they participated
Formula Nissan.
Yeah.
on the, I believe they have. I have to check in to make sure. I don't want to speak out of turn. So, but yeah, that is exactly what that looks like, right? How do we, this is our front line in terms of making sure that people have access to electric vehicles, and we need to support them and through that process. And that's really where this program has been instrumental in a way that no other funding to date has been brought to bear to support it.
Up to 50% less in cold weather range. Wow, that really kills you. Man, that's a tough one.
Yep.
And sometimes it means kind of a cooler ride.
Yeah, cool.
Especially if you're not gonna make it.
Yeah, right.
The last 2 miles can be tough.
Gene knows that.
Are you seeing that getting better, Dave? Do you think the cold weather? Or just not
Yes,
as much of it
it's
anymore?
getting better. There's hope down the line for new battery technology that's be a lot more resilient to cold temps. But for now, it's, the big thing is just the range has gotten so much longer. I mean, 10 years ago, I was driving a Nissan Leaf here with 84 miles of official range, 35 on a day like this. And now I have a Bolt, which is a couple of years old, but it's I can get here no
The
problem.
newer bolts actually are better. They are better. I
Yeah.
don't know. I don't know, particularly in cold weather, they don't. I don't know. They've done some improvements. They say not, but actually can get more miles. But those last 2 miles sometimes are a problem.
Well, as long as you got a chain at home.
Huh?
As long as you got a chain at home.
But that speaks to the importance of some of the work we're doing, because the automakers do a terrible job, in my opinion, of educating consumers on those cold weather range issues.
Yeah, they do.
And so, the training that is part of the Efficiency Vermont program speaks to that in detail, and certainly our website has resources related to that. Because it's really important if you're going into this that you're aware of some of the current issues.
One issue I wondered, maybe it's with the work with the dealers or just in general educating the public, is the need for a charging station at home. 'Cause I've talked to a couple of folks that bought a vehicle but didn't really think about it that much, about how they were going to charge it. So it's almost like I'd like to see part of the, if we get an electric car, you're forced to take a charger. Like, what is your charging plan? Because they bought an electric car that they thought they could do level 1, or they thought there was a level 2 close by, but then they didn't realize how long it
Yep.
takes. Now they're frustrated.
Or GMP will give you one for free, but you've got to
They
have it.
can't install
Right, you
it.
got to find an electrician who can install it, right? It's actually something, we've had some conversations about. It's not an easy nut to crack. Honestly, it should be part of the package of your purchase of your vehicle and the financing of the purchase of your
Yeah.
vehicle, that occurs with it, so that you get everything that you need in order to be able to operate the vehicle. It's a bit of a tougher nut to crack, but I think that that is certainly something we've had conversations with over time. And I know, I remember talking to a couple years ago, some folks like VSECU who are willing to sort of augment their vehicle loans with a loan to provide the installation of the charger, because as Senator Kitchell mentioned, while GMP, if you're in their territory, may give you one for free, you still have to pay for the installation of that, and especially if it's,
And you still have to do the work and figure it out. So it'd be nice to just like the day you picked up your car, there was a charger in the back seat and an appointment for the electrician to come install it. So,
Yep. I mean, it's frankly, it's a business model for electricians to stop by every dealer, right, and say, I'm ready.
Yeah.
Some automakers like Chevrolet has a program now where they partner with a company called Q-Merit that has a network of electricians, and that will pay for the installation or up to $1,000. You know, so if you need to upgrade your electric service, it won't cover all of that, but it is sort of bundled in. Or in Vermont, many utilities have programs, so it's not as.
No?
I'm exactly in this boat. My 15-year-old, I'm gonna buy her a plug-in for this fall, and I gotta run a i220 to the garage. I'm debating
You're
on doing
buying your daughter a
a plug-in, a used one, if anybody knows somebody.
You're surprised that somebody's buying something for their child?
I like the short range.
Well, thank you. Thank you for the reminder.
Welcome advice on how to do this as cheap as possible.
Okay, how we come?
Have one
Doing
child.
well. So I just want to wrap up. We've been pushing, you know, the information out there through a statewide electric vehicle campaign, both in terms of online advertising, bus wraps around town, like the one you see on the picture, really working with various partners to get information out, because there is still a lack of knowledge, information, and as we talked about, any number of issues, whether that be winter range or various things. We can get everybody to the Drive Electric Vermont website. We'll help move that along, but people have to know it's out there. People, you know, I often think about that transition to electric vehicles being a, you know, multi-stage process, right? Where you would never consider it, kind of warming to the idea, but are unsure, want to know more information, start to figure out that information. But there's a push, you know, at some point it involves some level of engagement, either with, you know, friends or neighbors who have one, or ultimately a dealer who can help you make that ultimate decision. But it is a process along the way. It is a wonderfully convenient way to drive around, I find, most of the time. And it is a shift in how we operate our vehicles and how we think about organizing our day around those trips. So lots to do here, but the campaign has been very successful, and I really look forward to keeping that up in 2023 to bring more information to Vermonters. Next slide. Is there a question?
Oh, I did have a question. Are you coordinating with the state of New Hampshire? It seems like their network is not particularly robust. You mentioned West Lev, but if you're coming up through 93 into St. Johnsbury, there's really nothing north of Manchester. So my question is, so much of our transportation and travel is regional, and you know, a lot of people like to go to Boston, for example. And so I was just wondering, as we're developing the network here in Vermont in the plan, how are we
Sure.
kind of
Yep.
thinking about our neighbors, because so much travel is actually, we're got a lot of borders here in Vermont, and
Yep.
how you're working with other states.
So this might be more a question for Patrick, because the National Electric Vehicle Infrastructure Program, you know, definitely has a national network of designated corridors, including several in New Hampshire. They've been certainly behind most other states in New England in rolling out, for example, the Volkswagen diesel settlement funds that many states have used for many years to support charging infrastructure. New Hampshire has lagged significantly in their ability to get that money out
I
the
think a
door.
lot of it can get to politics, right? Maybe they just don't believe in what Vermont believes, and so they're not putting the effort into doing with what Vermont believes.
They are finally coming along, I would say. You know, tourism obviously is
They
a
got a lot of
motivating
recreation
factor.
north of
Sure.
Manchester.
Yeah, so they're behind, but you should start to see more of their state environmental agency just closed out a procurement process for fast charging, including some of the north part of the state.
The state line, we've done it before. Want to take over more New Hampshire?
No, because we got the bridges.
Yeah, we don't want to pay.
We don't want the bridges. We don't want low water mark.
So certainly in the development of the NEVI plan, we connected with all of our neighbors, including province of Quebec. And the whole idea behind the formula funds is to build out that national network and have minimum standards so you can travel across borders and be able to have that reliable network where you can know that in the next 50 miles you'll come across another location of chargers that meets those minimum requirements. So there, it will take some time for sure, but at the end of this initial 5 years of funding, you'll have a fairly robust network of public fast charging that can begin to, as I said before, inspire private investment in the network as well.
Okay.
All right.
Go ahead, Peter.
So just as we leave you, and we missed your break unfortunately, but relatively quick. Couple things to think about. Obviously, that pandemic era supply chain challenge slowed down EV supplies, but buyers are ready, right? We're seeing that uptick in interest. Advanced Clean Cars 2, which is the ANR promulgated rule, that is the California rule about EV sales mandates, and the Advanced Clean Truck rules, which were referenced earlier, will have an impact on the mid and long-term outlook for the overall market. But that support system to make sure that transformation can happen at the speed of change we want it to happen is going to be necessary in the over the long term. Just want to put out there that that work that we are doing with dealers is set to sunset at the end of 2023, and we believe that work should continue. We're having conversations across the hall about what that looks like, but that it's an important work that will need to continue despite the additional federal revenue and everything else. We have more support, and yet we need the ability to make sure that the market can move along with the consumer.
Because it's a fast changing subject all the time, we welcome you back later on in the session. If you have any new information, we'd like to keep up with it because it is moving very rapidly, and it's always good to get an update where we are, because people are going to start asking us questions about it more and more, I think, which is good. Nothing wrong with that. So anything else? Okay, thank you very much this morning. Very interesting subject. There's a lot of questions that we